Right.
So my name is Jim Rivers, and I'm an associate professor of wildlife ecology in the College of Forestry at Oregon State University.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jim, for being with us today. And could you tell us just a little bit about your background, what drew you to forestry, where you started with education, and all of that sort of thing?
Sure. Ever since I was young, I was interested in wildlife and birds in particular. And so when I was in college, I was initially an engineering major, but engineering wasn't something that was really exciting me. And I thought long and hard about what sort of things that I would be able to research and study for a long time. And I kept coming back to wildlife and birds. And so I changed my major to wildlife biology as a sophomore. And then things just kind of grew from there. I got a lot of good mentoring from folks at the University of Massachusetts, where I did my undergraduate degree. And they really recommended to get out and see what's available, do research, get involved with projects. And that led to graduate school and ultimately led to my professor position now.
Yeah, so that was one of my other questions, actually, is if you had any influential mentors that helped you through your beginning of research, as your career progressed, like what was that experience like for you?
So my father was actually a forester here in Massachusetts. I'm actually based in Massachusetts right now because I'm on a sabbatical. And I got to go out in the woods with him as a youngster, and he taught me about forests and trees and wildlife as well. And so that was, I think, kind of the initial spark. We had bird feeders at my house, and my mom tells a story about how when I was young, we used to sit and watch the birds in the wintertime, and she credits that with my interest in birds. I don't know if that's true because I think I was maybe 2 months at the time. But as I went through college, there was several folks at UMass who were professors, and I was really fascinated by what they did. It never had dawned on me that you could kind of study animals for a living and be able to teach about them, and that was really something that I got excited about midway through my undergraduate career. And some of those mentors just, again, they emphasize the importance of kind of following what was of interest, getting out and seeing the world a bit. I grew up in Massachusetts, and I went to University of Massachusetts, which was in my backyard. And so at that point, I started to move out into other areas and realized that there was a world out there that I hadn't yet learned much about. And so that's really what got me going. So I think the mentoring piece was really to get involved and to try new things and see what worked and what didn't.
Yeah. And so how did your research focus change over time? Obviously, you started in Massachusetts and then moved to University of Oregon, or Oregon State rather. And yeah, did that change what you were focusing on? Was that more just kind of a natural progression? What did that look like for you?
Yeah, as an undergraduate, I researched birdsong with Don Kreutzma, who was at UMass at the time, and really enjoyed that. And it got me interested in bird behavior. So for my master's, I went to Kansas State University and was looking at a couple different components of bird use of habitat. And then I really got interested in the brown-headed cowbird, which is a brood parasitic species. It's like a cuckoo, and then the female lays her eggs into other species nests. And I ended up going to UC Santa Barbara for my PhD to work on cowbirds. And so when I finished up with my PhD, I was I was focused on birds, focused on behavior, interested in getting some experience with physiology. And so I started to do a little bit of physiological work as a postdoc at Oregon State University. But there I had a chance to start doing some work on pollinators in managed forests. And there was a call for proposals that was focused on management actions on insect pollinators, and was able to get a small grant to do that work. And it really opened my eyes because I had been spending a lot of time in regenerating conifer forests in the Pacific Northwest and was looking at the birds, but I was missing all of the bees that were in the same area and the other insect pollinators as well. And so it didn't really shift my focus as much as it expanded it into another group. And there are lots of differences between insects and birds, but there are also a lot of commonalities, particularly for bees, where female bees have a central nesting site, and they're bringing food back to that site. They're provisioning their offspring, much like birds do. So having the background in birds was, I think, a boost to thinking about bees, maybe a little bit different perspective than others who have worked on them.
Sure. Yeah, that's super interesting. And you say you got to work in managed forests in that area specifically. Was there anything in particular? Was it more kind of a practical application? Um, yeah, like what was that change? And did you kind of move to more of a practical application focus over time as
Yeah,
well? Yeah.
I did. And the work that I did for my PhD on cowbirds, which was really fun and really interesting, was much more basic science, more thinking about theory and how theory can be tested in the field. And what I had worked on for my master's, as I mentioned, was thinking about birds' use of wetlands in Kansas. And so I had the background of kind of management and conservation for my undergrad and my master's, and then kind of basic science for my PhD, which in the end, I think that worked out to be a great mix. I wish I could say I planned it that way, but it gave me kind of a foot in both of those areas. So when I did go to Oregon State University, my my interest was doing some physiological work, and it was really kind of physiology for the basis of physiology, not so much for conservation and management. But as it turned out, I ended up working in intensely managed Douglas fir plantations. And that's where my interest in pollinators started as well. So I've gone from kind of having that very basic science theoretical component for my PhD work into more management oriented research for my postdoc, and then that's kind of carried on as I've gone through my career. But I'm always interested in kind of the basic science piece, and I think a lot of times we need that to really understand what we can have for conservation and management. A lot of folks don't necessarily appreciate that. They say, well, that's just we don't want to fund that sort of research. We're really interested in this question. And I think it's always important to say, well, if we're going to answer the applied question, oftentimes we have to have an understanding of the basic biology of the organism or the understanding of the system before we start getting into that more applied piece. So I think both of those have to play off of each other.
Yeah, that's interesting. Has that posed any amount of a challenge for you as you're going through your work, or are there any other challenges that you've come across throughout the research process?
No, well, there's always the challenge of coming up with interesting questions and making sure that they are applied and getting funding for those research projects. But I would say that there's a lot of interest in insect pollinators right now, particularly in forests where I do the bulk of my work. And in some ways, it's been easier to show the applied aspects of forest insect pollinators. So I mentioned working in intensely managed timber plantations. Those are areas where in an intensively managed landscape, those are some of the only areas where there is regenerating forest. And where there's regenerating forest, there's often floral resources available for bees and other insect pollinators. So just by going out and harvesting some of these areas, we're creating the potential for pollinator habitat. And so that's been something that we've emphasized to landowners and land managers, that just by the process of what you do in the course of timber production, you may not be thinking about bees and insect pollinators, but you're influencing them. And I think that's true of any sort of land management activity that we have. There's lots of opportunity to piggyback research on some of those ongoing, in this case, silvicultural treatments, and have some really strong studies that ask questions about, well, what if we have treated an area in this way and another area this way? What are the difference between those two? So just to come back to your question, I think in some ways focusing on the management has actually been easier than focusing on the kind of the basic and applied aspects.
Sure, it's really interesting. And just to shift a little bit, I know that now you're working with a lab in Oregon State University. So how has that experience changed the way that you approach research or your career? What has it been like working with students and having that sort of environment?
Yeah, that it's quite a bit different from where I grew up in Massachusetts. And as I said, I'm back in Amherst now for a sabbatical, so it's kind of coming home to me again. And that is that in the vicinity of Corvallis, so much of our forest is managed for timber production. Excuse me. Oregon is one of the leaders in the United States for softwood timber production. And so there's a lot of interest and a lot of focus on forestry and forest management. And so I'm embedded in the College of Forestry at OSU. And so that means that there are a lot of opportunities to work with students who are interested in these topics, to work with landowners, whether they're small landowners or large landowners like some of the big companies. There's a lot of interest in pollinators, and people really understand how it's linked back to the proper management of forests, as well as the industry. So it's quite a bit different there. Um, in that sense, there's a lot of opportunities, I think, that aren't in other areas where timber production is not as big a part of the local economy.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And um, just thinking about how the industry has changed over the time that you've been working in it and doing research, is there anything that you see as a shift, anything you would like to see as a shift in the future? Or just, if you would like to reflect on how things have changed and what you think is interesting or constructive about that.
Yeah, I don't, I can't say that I've been working, I don't feel like I've worked in managed forest long enough to really see a long-term change. What I've realized though is that land managers are really interested in the elements of forest biodiversity that are impacted by their management. And I think a lot of people don't appreciate that. If you're growing trees for timber production, that's your primary goal, but there's always the component of, well, how is this impacting forest biodiversity? How is it impacting wildlife, for example? And so I've been surprised by that. Early on, when I got into pollinators, we held a workshop at Oregon State University. And what we wanted to do was to come up with a research agenda for pollinators and managed forest. And the idea was we had just completed our first study, and I didn't want to put forth the idea that I knew what land managers wanted. So we invited land managers, agency scientists, academic scientists, policymakers to this workshop. And I was expecting that maybe there'd be maybe 20 or 30 people there. We'd have a discussion. We had nearly 100 people that showed up for that workshop. And what was really interesting is we had the morning dedicated to scientific presentations, just to give an overview of pollinators. The afternoon was a facilitated discussion with some of our extension folks. And what we found was that everyone was essentially seeing the situation the same. What they thought was important was that we had basic information about pollinators and managed forests, and that we worked towards studies that understood why or how pollinators respond to different types of forest management practices. Something as simple as what happens when you put a road in, what happens when you spray for herbicides, a lot of the things that we do on a regular basis in many of our forests. So that was really telling to me, because sitting in that room, I expected the academic scientists to show up, but the land managers and the wildlife biologists from some of the big companies were there too, and they were equally interested and excited about the work that we've been doing. And that's carried forward more than a decade now, where we've had support from industry to come work on their lands, to collaborate on projects. And it's been really great to see that interest has always been there. And I think it's developed over the past decade from some of the work that we've been doing.
Yeah, and I think that's a good transition into talking about the special issue that we just ran on forest pollinators, which you were obviously a co-editor of, came in as a guest editor, and I know you're sticking around as an associate editor for JoF. So could you just talk about the process maybe of helming that special issue, developing those research questions and bringing that together?
Yeah, so it started from an email that Dr. Brenda McComb, the editor-in-chief, sent out to a number of her colleagues. And I've known Brenda for quite a few years through different circles, including Oregon State University. And what Brenda had said was, we're interested in doing some of these special issues. And if you have a topic, let us know if it might be something that resonates with you. And I immediately thought of insect pollinators. And so I reached out to a long-term collaborator, Mike Ulishin, and said, Mike, what do you think of this idea? And he said, oh, I like it. I think it's something that we can run with. So we stepped back and said, well, who could we ask to be involved with this? Mike and I have, as we went through the list, we realized that we probably knew most people in at least the United States who are working on insect pollinators in forests. And so we reached out to a number of folks and said, would you be interested in this special issue? And a lot of them said, yes, we have a paper that we think would go really well, and we'd like to be involved. So we kind of put that together and proposed it to Brenda, and Brenda was excited about it. And she said, yeah, let's move forward with it. And it was a process that obviously took a while. We had 13 different papers in the special issue, but it was a process that was enjoyable. We got to learn about a lot of the new research that's coming online. It's just been completed, and we one of the things that came out of that special issue is Mike and I did a review paper, and we found that although there's been a lot of increase in the number of publications and a lot of interest in pollinators and managed forests, there still isn't a lot out there. And I think that's important because there's lots of opportunities to do new research that's going to fill a lot of those knowledge gaps. And in our review paper, we've outlined several areas that we thought would be good for that.
Yeah. Do you want to talk through any of those?
Yeah, so I think the one of the things that comes up oftentimes is whether or not insect pollinators are specialists within forests or whether those might be species that are more broadly found. And so we put forth the idea that we really need to start thinking about those species and going beyond individual studies, but really looking and saying, where do we find certain species? Are they generalists? Where we worked, or at least where we have worked so far, we don't see that there's any specialists in forests in the Pacific Northwest, at least in the western side of Oregon. That's different from eastern deciduous forests, where we have quite a few specialist bees in forests. So kind of adopting that broader perspective, I think, is important. We also talked about studying bees in older forests. We have old growth forests in the Pacific Northwest, for example, where as part of another project, I remember walking through an area and seeing lots of bumblebees in the understory. And that was a surprise to me at the time. I was studying pollinators and said, wait, I never thought that we'd find many in here. So thinking about some of those older forests and how they may be housing some of our bee biodiversity, it's like pollinator biodiversity. And then again, there's lots of things related to management that we just haven't had a lot of information about. There are probably 2 or 3 studies on herbicide application intensity and how that influences pollinator communities. We have very little information about roads, whether roads are good or bad for pollinators within these managed forest landscapes. And there's just lots out there that I think we still would benefit by a lot more studies. We ended up finding 60 studies that we thought were management relevant, and most of those came out in the less than the last 10 years or so. So there's been a real pulse of new research, but a long ways to go as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, you're talking about new research and bringing on more students and everything. Is there any particular advice that you would give for others wishing to do similar research, students, early career professionals? We obviously have a very forestry focused membership. And so is there any particular advice that you would give in terms of moving towards that research?
Well, for students, I always think it's important for them to follow their interests. And one of the things that is important for students to understand is that they may try a summer position, for example, a field job, and they may not like it. And that is actually useful information for them, because if they don't like it as a summer position, they're not going to like it as a permanent position or a graduate school position. The other thing I'd say is that there are lots of opportunities to get involved with research at the kind of the summer field technician level. And so those are jobs that are out there. They often fill up quickly because there's so much interest in pollinators now. So if there are students out there looking for those sorts of jobs, we always start advertising just after the holidays. So some students don't realize that they need to start that early. So that's one piece of advice I would give to a kind of an early career person who's thinking about trying to get some experience in pollinators. And I would say that there's lots of different studies that are out there, and it may not be as important to focus on the exact study that you want to do. Maybe you want to work in meadows and alpine areas. Maybe you don't get that position, but if you're working with pollinators, you can certainly gauge whether that's of interest and then work towards those positions that are really interesting.
Yeah, that's great advice. And this is something that we just like to ask everybody who we interview, which is there anything in particular that has surprised you about your career, about the field? You can take this in any direction you'd like, but we always just find it interesting to see what the surprises really bring out, because it's such a diverse industry.
Yeah. Well, I guess maybe the biggest surprise to me is how much time I spend thinking about insects, in particular bees.
Mhm.
Um, it's something that, as I said earlier, it was kind of filtered out as I was in the field looking at birds and searching for bird nests in some of those regenerating forests, and it was right at my feet, literally, lots of times. And so it's somewhat surprising to me how far I've gone into the bee world, and but it's also really interesting too because it reminds me, and I think it's useful for students, particularly graduate students, is that whatever they do their thesis or their dissertation work on, it doesn't mean that they have to do that going forward. They can always kind of switch. And as I said earlier, the experience that I've had doing research with birds, I think has really translated well to working with insects, with bees in particular, because there's so many commonalities in terms of nesting behavior. I studied the brown-headed cowbird, as I said, which is a brood parasite. With bees, we have what we call kleptoparasites, and they're bees that do the same thing. They search for nests of bees, they sneak in, they lay an egg, and then they leave very quickly. So the commonalities are really there. And so that's sometimes I say, well, I've moved so far from what I started out with and what was interesting, but in some ways that's not all that surprising.
Yeah, yeah. And I know you mentioned you're on sabbatical right now. Do you want to talk about the research that you're working on currently or anything exciting you have coming up?
Yeah, so we've got several projects in the lab right now that are in various stages of completion. We have a project where we're looking at shaded fuel breaks in Northern California and characterizing bee communities there. And we're finding that they're really diverse, but we're also finding that reference sites that are untreated are also diverse. And part of that is just it's a different type of forest than what we've typically worked with in Western Oregon. We've got other studies that are looking at bee reproductive output in response to large-scale wildfires. We're looking at bees in response to thinning and prescribed fire in the eastern part of Oregon. And then one project that I've been working on for my sabbatical is trying to understand how simulated climate change is influential on bee reproductive behaviors and reproductive output. And there we're using a model species to actually heat their nests at pretty small temperatures above ambient. And we have a system where we have a thermostat that tracks the ambient temperature range and then heats the nests to a set point above that. So you could go 2 degrees Celsius or 3 degrees Celsius. And that's been really fun to think about how do some of these really subtle changes in the abiotic conditions influence the bees in terms of their nesting or their reproductive output, which obviously has really important implications as we go through time.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm curious to see how that goes. And I just want to open up the floor. We're wrapping up here, but if there's anything that you wanted to get a chance to talk about that we didn't touch on already, feel free to do so now.
I guess I would close by just saying that this has been, in terms of research on forest pollinators, it's been really interesting to get involved in an area where very little has been done in the past, not to say nothing, but very little, particularly when you compare it with things like agricultural settings where we know a lot about bees in those settings because they're so important for our crops and for food security. And so thinking about how this small area has kind of grown over time is it's one of the things that I think I can look back on my career and see that change through time and having been involved with it is really neat to see.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, thank you again, Jim, for being with us today. This is super exciting. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording, but
Thank
I
you.
I really appreciate you taking the time today.